The phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the silence of my workshop like a chainsaw through pine. I'd been hunched over my workbench for 3 hours, sanding down cabinet doors for Mrs. Patterson's kitchen renovation, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander to places it shouldn't go. Places like wondering what my wife Vanessa was really doing during those late client meetings with her real estate partners. "Dad?" Maddie's voice was barely a whisper, trembling like autumn leaves before a storm. "Hey, sweetheart." "What's wrong? You should be asleep." I set down my sandpaper, already knowing this wasn't going to be good news. 8-year-olds don't call their fathers at midnight unless something's gone sideways. "Dad," he hit Mom with a hammer. The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding her breath. Now he's looking for me with something that makes sparks. I'm hiding in my closet, my blood turned to ice water. "Who, Maddie?" "Who hit Mom?" "The policeman, the one who comes over when you're not here. Greg. He's really mad and he's breaking things downstairs. Mom's crying and there's blood on the kitchen floor." "Officer Greg Larkin." Of course it was Greg. The same Greg who'd been showing up at my house for routine neighborhood checks whenever I was out on job sites. The same Greg whose patrol car I'd spotted in my driveway 3 times last week while I was supposedly at the hardware store, but had doubled back for forgotten tools. "Stay exactly where you are, baby. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Daddy's coming home right now." I was already grabbing my keys, my mind racing through the 15-minute drive from my workshop to the house. 15 minutes. Anything could happen in 15 minutes. "Hurry, Dad." "I think he's coming upstairs." The line went dead. I've built houses from foundation to roof, rewired electrical systems that would fry most people, and once pulled a man from a burning car on Route 1. But nothing had ever made my hands shake like they did starting up my pickup truck that night. As I tore down Maple Street toward home, my mind filled in the blanks I'd been too stupid or too trusting to see before. Vanessa's late showings that ran until midnight. Her new workout routine that required special clothes I never saw her wear. The way she'd started doing laundry herself instead of letting it pile up for our weekly wash day. And Greg, good old Officer Greg with his perfect smile and his habit of lingering just a little too long when he stopped by to check on things. I should have married a librarian. At least they only shush you. The house looked normal from the outside. White colonial with black shutters, the porch light glowing like everything was fine. But Vanessa's BMW was parked crooked in the driveway, and I could see broken glass glinting on the front steps. My stomach clenched as I noticed Greg's personal truck, not his patrol car, parked half a block down like he was trying to hide it. I killed the engine and sat for exactly 5 seconds, listening. No screaming, no sounds of violence. Just the normal nighttime chorus of crickets and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Either things had calmed down, or they'd gotten much worse. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly open. I pushed it with 2 fingers and stepped into what looked like a tornado had hit my living room. The coffee table was overturned, magazines scattered everywhere. One of Vanessa's precious decorative vases lay in pieces near the fireplace. And there, on the hardwood floor I'd installed myself 2 summers ago, were dark drops that could only be blood. "Vanessa?" I called out, not too loud. No answer. I moved through the house like I was walking through a minefield, every floorboard creak making me wince. The kitchen was worse. Chairs knocked over, cabinet doors hanging open, and a small pool of blood near the island where we'd eaten breakfast that morning, like a normal family. That's when I heard voices upstairs, low, urgent, arguing. "You said he never comes home before midnight on Thursdays." Greg's voice, tight with anger. "He doesn't usually." Something must have happened. Vanessa trying to sound calm but failing. "Well, he's going to find out eventually. Might as well be tonight." I took the stairs 2 at a time, not caring any more about noise. The voices were coming from our bedroom, my bedroom, where I'd slept alone more nights than not over the past 6 months while Vanessa claimed the couch was better for her back. The door was cracked open. Through the gap, I could see Greg standing near the window, still in his uniform, but with his shirt untucked and his badge crooked. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed, our bed, holding a dish towel against her forehead. Even from the hallway, I could see the dark stain spreading across the white terry cloth. "Where's Maddie?" I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. They both spun toward me like they'd been caught robbing a bank. Greg's hand went instinctively to his service weapon, and for a moment I thought he might actually draw on me in my own bedroom. "Cal." Vanessa's voice was steady, but her eyes were darting between Greg and me like she was calculating angles. "Thank God you're here." There was a break-in. Greg responded to the call. I looked around the room. Nothing was disturbed, no signs of a struggle. The jewelry box on Vanessa's dresser was still open, her expensive earrings glinting in the lamplight. What kind of burglar breaks into a house, beats up the owner, and leaves without taking anything? "Funny thing about that break-in," I said, keeping my voice level. "Maddie called me 20 minutes ago, said she watched a police officer hit her mother with a hammer. Now what are the odds?" Greg stepped forward, his chest puffed out like a rooster in a henhouse. "You need to be very careful about the accusations you make, Cal. Very careful." "Is that a threat, Officer Larkin?" "It's friendly advice." Vanessa stood up, still holding the bloody towel. "Cal, please. You don't understand the situation. I understand it perfectly." I looked at both of them, these two people who'd been playing me for a fool while I was out working 60-hour weeks to pay for this house, this life, this lie. "I understand that my wife is sleeping with a married police officer. I understand that when I got too close to figuring it out, he decided to shut her up with violence. And I understand that my 8-year-old daughter is hiding in her closet because she's afraid for her life." The silence stretched out like a wire about to snap. Finally, Greg smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind predators give their prey right before they strike. "You can't prove any of that." "Maybe not. But I can try." That's when I heard the sirens. 3 patrol cars arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights painting my house like a crime scene, which I suppose it was. Greg had called for backup the moment he heard my truck in the driveway, spinning a story about a domestic disturbance and an agitated husband with a history of anger issues. News to me, since the only thing I'd ever been angry about was the Patriots defense giving up 30 points to the Jets last season. Chief Morrison showed up personally, which should have been my first clue that this whole thing was orchestrated. Dave Morrison had been Greg's partner for 5 years before getting promoted, and they still grabbed beers together every Friday at the Blue Lobster. Small-town politics at its finest. "Cal, I need you to step outside while we sort this out," Morrison said, not quite meeting my eyes. Behind him, 2 younger officers were already photographing the living room damage and interviewing Vanessa, who had somehow managed to produce more tears and a more dramatic version of events. "This is my house, Dave. I know, and we'll get it all straightened out. But right now, I need you to give us some space." I looked past him to where Greg was standing near the kitchen, playing the concerned first responder. He caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod, like he was saying checkmate. "Where's my daughter?" "Safe. Mrs. Henley from next door is looking after her. At least Maddie was out of this mess." Mrs. Henley was 73, made the best apple pie in Cumberland County, and had probably seen more than she was letting on. She had a clear view of my driveway from her kitchen window and a memory like a steel trap. I spent the next 2 hours sitting in my pickup truck in my own driveway, watching strangers treat my home like evidence in a case I didn't understand. Neighbors came out to gawk, some genuinely concerned, others just hungry for gossip. In a town like Millbrook, Maine, scandal spreads faster than black ice on Route 302. Ruby Castellano from the Blue Lobster brought me coffee in a thermos around 1 a.m. Ruby knew everyone's business in town, partly because she served half the population their daily alcohol, and partly because she had an ear for secrets and a talent for making people talk. "Hell of a thing," she said, settling her considerable bulk against my truck's tailgate. "Vanessa's in there telling everyone who'll listen that you've been threatening her for months." "That's interesting, considering I've been working 16-hour days and barely see her except at breakfast." Ruby sipped her own coffee, studying the circus on my front lawn. "Course, some folks might wonder why Greg Larkin's personal truck is parked 3 blocks away instead of in your driveway with the other official vehicles." I looked at her sharply. "You saw that?" "Honey, I see everything. Comes with the territory." She patted my shoulder with one weathered hand. "You're going to need friends for what's coming. Good thing you've got some." By 2 a.m., the circus was winding down. The other officers had finished their photographs and interviews. Chief Morrison approached my truck with the kind of expression doctors wear when they're about to deliver bad news. "Here's how this is going to work, Cal. Vanessa's filing for a restraining order first thing Monday morning. Until then, you're not to set foot in that house or make any contact with your wife." "What about Maddie?" "Supervised visits only, through the court." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. "Dave, you've known me for 15 years. You know I would never hurt my family. I know. But I also know what I see, and what I see is a woman with a head injury and a house that looks like someone went through it with a sledgehammer." He paused, glancing back toward the house where Greg was helping Vanessa into an ambulance for a precautionary trip to the emergency room. "I'm sorry, Cal. I really am." As the last patrol car pulled away, I sat alone in my driveway, looking at the house I'd bought with my own money, renovated with my own hands, and filled with furniture I'd built in my workshop. Now I was locked out of it like a criminal, while the real criminal got to play hero. But Ruby was right about one thing. I had friends. And in a small town, friends can be worth more than lawyers, especially when those friends have eyes and ears and long memories. I drove to my workshop and spent the rest of the night making a list of everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. By sunrise, I had a plan. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be thorough. If Greg Larkin wanted to play games, I'd show him how a carpenter approaches a demolition job, carefully, methodically, and with the right tools for the task. The first tool I needed was information, and I knew exactly where to get it. Vern's Hardware opened at 6 a.m. sharp, 7 days a week, and had been doing so for 37 years. Vern Hutchins was older than dirt, tougher than a $2 steak, and knew more about the people of Millbrook than the town historian. He also owed me 3 favors from the time I'd rewired his entire store for free after a kitchen fire nearly put him out of business. I was waiting by his front door when he arrived at 5:45, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner and wearing the kind of expression that said I'd had a long night. "Heard about your troubles," Vern said without preamble, unlocking the door. "Coffee's appreciated, but I'm guessing you want more than sympathy. Information, and maybe some help. Both of those I got in abundance. Come on back." Vern's office was a cramped space behind the paint counter, filled with 30 years' worth of invoices, catalogs, and local gossip. He settled behind his desk like a king taking his throne and waited for me to start talking. I told him everything: the phone call from Maddie, the scene at the house, Greg's performance for the other officers. Vern listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small notes on a yellow legal pad. "So, what do you need?" he asked when I finished. "First, I need to know how long this thing between Vanessa and Greg has been going on. Second, I need to know if there are others." "Others?" "Other women. Other affairs. Other times Greg's used his badge to cover up his mistakes." Vern leaned back in his chair, which creaked like an old ship. "The Vanessa thing's been going on about 4 months. Started right after that real estate conference in Portland. As for others." He pulled out a different notebook, this one black and considerably thicker. "Greg's got a history. 3 complaints filed against him in the past 2 years for inappropriate conduct during traffic stops. All young women, all dropped after Chief Morrison had conversations with the complainants. Jesus. Gets better. Greg's been married to Linda for 8 years, but she filed for divorce twice, once in 2019, once last year. Both times she withdrew the paperwork after spending a weekend at her sister's house in Bangor. Sister told Ruby that Linda showed up with bruises both times. I felt my hands clenching into fists. Morrison knows about this? Morrison knows about everything. But Greg's his golden boy, and Linda's never pressed charges. Hard to prosecute what nobody reports. What about Vanessa? Has she been seeing anyone else? Vern flipped a few pages in his black book. Kyle Brennan, from her real estate office. Started about 6 weeks ago, overlapping with Greg. She's been playing both ends against the middle. Kyle Brennan. I knew him by reputation. Slick, ambitious, the kind of guy who wore expensive suits to sell modest houses and treated every handshake like a business opportunity. If Vanessa was juggling 2 affairs, she was either incredibly reckless or incredibly confident. I need proof, I said. Proof costs money. How much money? Vern smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. For you? Just a promise that when this is over, you'll remember who your real friends are. He made 3 phone calls while I waited. The first was to his nephew Danny, who worked IT support for half the businesses in town. The second was to Mrs. Henley, my elderly neighbor. The third was to someone he called only Birdie, and the conversation consisted mostly of grunts and yes or no questions. Danny can get into Vanessa's work computer remotely. She uses the same password for everything, and it's not exactly Fort Knox security. Mrs. Henley's been keeping a log of comings and goings at your house for the past 2 months, bless her suspicious heart, and Birdie's got photographs. Photographs of what? Greg's truck parked behind the Riverside Motel last Tuesday afternoon. Same time Vanessa told you she was showing a house in Brunswick. I sat back in my chair, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. How long have you been collecting this information? Since about a week after it started. Small town, California. People notice things and people talk. Most of us were just waiting for you to notice too. Why didn't anyone tell me? Vern's expression softened slightly. Because you're a good man who loves his wife and daughter, and nobody wanted to be the one to break your heart. We figured you'd figure it out eventually. Well, I figured it out. Now what? Now we document everything, build a case, and when the time comes, we make sure Greg Larkin learns that actions have consequences. Over the next 3 hours, Vern and I assembled a timeline that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Danny sent over screenshots of Vanessa's email account, including several exchanges with both Greg and Kyle that left no doubt about the nature of their relationships. Mrs. Henley provided a handwritten log that detailed every suspicious vehicle, every unusual visitor, and every time she'd heard raised voices from my house. But it was Birdie's photographs that really sealed the deal. Birdie turned out to be a retired private investigator who now spent his time bird-watching and documenting what he called unusual mating behaviors in the local population. His telephoto lens had captured Greg and Vanessa in several compromising positions, as well as Vanessa and Kyle together at the motel. This is enough to destroy both their careers, I said, looking through the evidence. Careers, marriages, reputations, the whole 9 yards, Vern agreed. Question is, what do you want to do with it? That was the question, wasn't it? I could take everything to a lawyer, file for divorce, and let the legal system sort it out. Greg might face discipline from the department, Vanessa might lose her real estate license, and I might get custody of Maddie along with a hefty settlement. But that felt too clean, too simple. Greg had put his hands on my wife in anger, terrorized my daughter, and then used his position to paint me as the villain. Kyle had helped wreck my marriage for his own entertainment. Vanessa had betrayed every promise she'd ever made to me and put our daughter in danger. The legal system would give them consequences, but it wouldn't give them justice. I want them to understand what it feels like to lose everything, I said finally. I want them to know that their actions have consequences, and I want those consequences to hurt. Vern nodded slowly. That's going to take more than evidence. That's going to take strategy. Then let's strategize. The beauty of small-town gossip is that it spreads like spilled paint, quickly, messily, and into places you never expected. Ruby Castellano understood this better than anyone, which is why I found myself at the Blue Lobster at 4 p.m. on Friday, nursing a beer I didn't want, and waiting for the after-work crowd to arrive. "You sure about this?" Ruby asked, wiping down the bar for the third time in 10 minutes. "Once this horse leaves the barn, you can't get it back." "I'm sure, because there are other ways to handle this. Quieter ways." I looked at her across the scarred wooden bar top. Ruby had been married to the same man for 42 years, raised 3 kids, and built a successful business in a town that didn't make it easy for women to succeed. If anyone understood the value of loyalty and the cost of betrayal, it was her. "Ruby, Greg Larkin hit my wife with a hammer and scared my daughter so badly she's having nightmares. Then he used his badge to make me look like the bad guy. Quiet isn't going to cut it." She nodded and reached under the bar, pulling out a manila envelope. "Danny dropped this off an hour ago. Said to tell you he found some interesting things in the police department's email system." I opened the envelope and found printouts of several email exchanges between Greg and Chief Morrison. The subject lines alone were enough to make my blood boil. Cal Becker situation, domestic response protocols, and narrative coordination. The emails revealed a level of premeditation that made my stomach turn. Greg had been planning this setup for weeks, feeding Morrison a steady diet of lies about my increasingly erratic behavior and concerning statements about my marriage. Morrison, for his part, had been all too willing to believe his golden boy's version of events. "Son of a bitch," I muttered. "Language," Ruby said automatically, then grinned. "But yeah, pretty much." The door chimed, and the first wave of the after-work crowd began filtering in. I recognized most of them. Construction workers from the new subdivision project, a few teachers from the elementary school, some of the town office staff. People who knew me, who'd done business with me, who'd invited me to their barbecues and asked me to fix their kitchen cabinets. People who'd been hearing Greg's version of events for the past 3 days. I waited until the bar was about half full, then stood up and cleared my throat. "Can I have everyone's attention for a minute?" The conversations died down, and 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Some curious, some sympathetic, some clearly uncomfortable. "I know there's been talk about what happened at my house Tuesday night," I began. "I know some of you have heard that I threatened my wife, maybe even hurt her. I want you to know that's not true." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. At the far end of the bar, I saw Tom Bradley from the school board lean forward, listening intently. "What is true is that my wife has been having affairs with 2 different men. One of them is Kyle Brennan from Coastal Properties. The other is Officer Greg Larkin." I reached into my jacket and pulled out one of Birdie's photographs. Nothing too explicit, but clear enough to leave no doubt about what was happening. This was taken last Tuesday at the Riverside Motel, about 3 hours before Greg showed up at my house. The silence was complete now. Ruby had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was watching the crowd's reaction with professional interest. Greg came to my house that night to confront my wife about something. Maybe he found out about Kyle, maybe she tried to break things off. Either way, he lost his temper and hit her. My 8-year-old daughter witnessed the whole thing and called me terrified. I pulled out another photograph, this one showing Greg's truck parked 3 blocks from my house. When I got home, Greg spun a story about a break-in and domestic violence, painting me as the aggressor. Chief Morrison backed his play, and I got kicked out of my own house. The murmurs were getting louder now, more agitated. I could see people pulling out their phones, probably texting the news to friends and family. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Millbrook would know the real story. "I'm not asking you to take sides," I continued. "I'm just asking you to remember who I am. You've known me for 15 years. You've hired me to work on your homes, trusted me with your family's safety. Have I ever given you reason to think I'm violent? Have I ever been anything but honest in my dealings with you? Tom Bradley spoke up from the back. Cal, this is a hell of an accusation you're making. You got any proof besides photographs? I smiled and pulled out the manila envelope. Emails between my wife and both her lovers, bank records showing payments to the Riverside Motel, and a log kept by my neighbor documenting every suspicious visitor to my house over the past 2 months. I set the envelope on the bar. Ruby's got copies for anyone who wants to see them. I'm not hiding anything. The crowd pressed forward, eager to examine the evidence. Within minutes, the entire bar was buzzing with conversation as people passed around photographs and printouts. I could see the shift happening in real time, doubt turning to understanding, sympathy replacing suspicion. Jesus, Cal, said Mike Torres, a plumber I'd worked with on several jobs. I heard Greg's version at the diner yesterday. Made you sound like a real psycho. Greg's a good storyteller, I replied. But he's not the only one who can tell stories. That's when the door opened and Kyle Brennan walked in, probably looking for his usual Friday happy hour crowd. He took 3 steps into the bar before realizing that every conversation had stopped and every eye was on him. Kyle, Ruby called out cheerfully. Perfect timing. We were just discussing your photography work. She held up one of Bertie's pictures, Kyle and Vanessa in a passionate embrace outside the motel room door. Kyle's face went white, then red, then white again. That's not... This is a private matter, he stammered. Was, I corrected. It was a private matter. Now it's a public service announcement. Kyle looked around the bar, seeing nothing but hostile faces and knowing smirks. He'd built his reputation in this town on being trustworthy, professional, the kind of agent who'd never steer you wrong. That reputation was currently being shredded by 20 pairs of eyes and twice as many wagging tongues. You can't do this, he said, his voice cracking slightly. This is harassment. No, I replied calmly. This is consequences. Kyle turned and fled, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. The bar erupted in laughter and applause, but I wasn't done yet. The real target hadn't shown up. I didn't have to wait long. Greg Larkin walked into the Blue Lobster at exactly 5:47 p.m., just like he had every Friday for the past 3 years. He was out of uniform, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, probably expecting to grab a beer and shoot some pool with his buddies. Instead, he walked into a room full of people who now knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The silence was immediate and complete. Greg looked around, confused, until his eyes landed on me sitting at the bar with the manila envelope in front of me. Well, well, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Officer Larkin, how's the head injury business treating you? Greg's jaw tightened. Cal, you need to be very careful here. Or what? You'll hit me with a hammer too? The crowd stirred, sensing blood in the water. Greg realized he was surrounded by hostile faces and reached for his phone, probably to call for backup. I wouldn't, Ruby said conversationally. Cell service is terrible in here. Something about the metal roof. Greg pocketed his phone and tried to salvage the situation. Folks, I know Cal's been spreading some wild stories, but you need to understand that he's under a lot of stress right now. People say things when they're hurting. Like this. I held up a printout of one of his emails to Chief Morrison. Quote, Cal Becker's behavior has become increasingly erratic. I'm concerned he may pose a threat to his family. End quote. Sent 2 days before you ever set foot in my house. The crowd pressed closer, and Greg took an involuntary step backward. Or how about this one? I held up another email. Quote, suggest we coordinate our narrative regarding the domestic response. Cal has friends in town who might try to muddy the waters. End quote. Greg's face was flushed now, sweat beading on his forehead. Those are taken out of context. Context, I repeated. Right. Like the context of you screwing my wife while planning to frame me for domestic violence? That's when Greg made his mistake. Instead of leaving, instead of trying to de-escalate, he let his temper get the better of him. Your wife came to me, California. She was scared of you, afraid of what you might do. Everything I did was to protect her. Protect her? I stood up slowly. Is that what you call hitting her with a hammer? My daughter saw you. She called me, terrified, while you were hunting her through the house with a taser. The crowd was getting uglier now, closing in around Greg like wolves around wounded prey. These were people who knew Maddie, who'd watched her grow up, who'd given her candy at Halloween and birthday presents at parties. Greg looked around desperately, realizing he was trapped. This is all lies. Fabricated evidence. You people are idiots if you believe this garbage. Wrong thing to say. Very wrong thing to say. Tom Bradley stepped forward, all 6'4" of him. Are you calling us idiots, Greg? I'm calling this man a liar and a manipulator who's trying to destroy my reputation because he can't handle the truth about his marriage. The truth, I said quietly, is that you're a corrupt cop who uses his badge to cover up his crimes. The truth is that you terrorized an 8-year-old girl and then tried to frame her father. The truth is that everyone in this room now knows exactly what kind of man you are. Greg's hand moved toward his waistband, where his off-duty weapon would be holstered. It was an instinctive gesture, but in a room full of people who already thought he was dangerous, it was also incredibly stupid. Easy there, officer, Ruby said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We're all friends here. Greg realized what he'd done and slowly moved his hand away from his gun. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen the gesture, understood the threat. Get out, Tom Bradley said quietly. Get out now, before this gets ugly. Greg looked around the room one more time, seeing nothing but contempt and disgust. This isn't over, he said, pointing at me. You're right, I replied. It's not. Greg left, and the bar erupted in conversation. People were already pulling out their phones, spreading the news to friends and family throughout the town. By morning, Greg Larkin would be the most hated man in Millbrook. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Humiliation was just the first course. The main event was still to come. 3 days later, the whole town was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. Greg had called in sick to work Monday and Tuesday, probably trying to figure out how to salvage his reputation. Vanessa had holed up in our house, my house, with the curtains drawn and the phone unplugged. Kyle had put his condo on the market and was telling anyone who'd listen that he was exploring opportunities in Portland. But I wasn't done with any of them yet. The beauty of being a carpenter is that you understand how things are built, which means you also understand how they come apart. Every structure has weak points, stress fractures, places where the right pressure applied at the right time can bring the whole thing tumbling down. I'd been studying the structure of Greg Larkin's life for 3 days, and I'd found his weak point. Wednesday morning, I drove to the state police barracks in Gray and asked to speak with Detective Sarah Chen, who handled internal affairs investigations for Cumberland County. I'd done some research on Detective Chen, 15-year veteran, spotless record, and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to corrupt cops. Mr. Becker, she said, settling across from me in a sterile interview room, I understand you have some concerns about Officer Larkin's conduct. I opened my briefcase, the same one I used for job estimates, and laid out everything I had. The photographs, the emails, the witness statements, the timeline. Detective Chen examined each piece of evidence methodically, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. This is quite comprehensive, she said finally. How long did it take you to assemble all this? About a week. But the evidence goes back months. And you're alleging that Officer Larkin not only conducted an extramarital affair, but also used his position to cover up domestic violence and frame you for crimes you didn't commit? That's exactly what I'm alleging. Detective Chen leaned back in her chair. Mr. Becker, you should know that we've had our eye on Officer Larkin for some time. There have been irregularities in his conduct that we've been investigating. What kind of irregularities? I can't discuss an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you that your evidence fills in some significant gaps in our case. She stood up and shook my hand. We'll be in touch. In the meantime, I'd recommend you be very careful. Cornered animals can be unpredictable. I left the barracks feeling like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The state police would handle Greg through official channels, but I still had personal business to settle. That evening, I drove to Vanessa's real estate office. Coastal Properties occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, all gleaming hardwood floors and carefully staged furniture designed to make clients feel successful and sophisticated. Vanessa's BMW was in the parking lot, along with 2 other cars I didn't recognize. I walked in like I owned the place, which in a sense I did. I'd installed all the crown molding and built-in shelving 2 years ago when they'd renovated. Cal? Jennifer Walsh, the receptionist, looked surprised to see me. How are you holding up? Better every day, Jen. Is Vanessa available? She's in a meeting with clients, but I think she's almost finished. I could hear voices from the conference room, Vanessa's professional real estate agent voice, smooth and confident. She was showing a young couple through listing photos, probably trying to convince them that a fixer-upper was a charming opportunity for customization. Actually, Jen, could you give these to Vanessa when she's done? I handed her a manila envelope. Tell her they're the final papers she's been waiting for. Jen took the envelope, looking curious but professional. Of course. Anything else? Just that I hope she's saved some money for a good lawyer. I left the office and drove to my workshop, where I spent the next 2 hours building a small wooden box with dovetail joints and a brass nameplate. It was beautiful work, the kind of craftsmanship that takes years to master. When I was finished, I placed a single item inside the box and drove to the police station. Chief Morrison was just leaving for the day when I pulled into the parking lot. He saw me coming and tried to duck back inside, but I called his name loudly enough that the desk sergeant heard me through the open door. Cal, Morrison said, clearly uncomfortable. What can I do for you? I wanted to give you this. I handed him the wooden box. Consider it a retirement gift. Morrison opened the box and found Greg's police badge inside, the one I'd lifted from his shirt during the confrontation at the Blue Lobster. His face went pale. How did you? Greg dropped it Friday night. Figured you'd want it back before Internal Affairs comes asking questions. Morrison's hands were shaking slightly as he closed the box. Cal, if you're thinking about doing something stupid, Dave, the only stupid thing I've done in the past 15 years was trust the wrong people. But I'm done being stupid. I left him standing in the parking lot, holding the box like it might explode. Thursday morning brought the news I'd been waiting for. Greg Larkin had been suspended pending investigation, and Detective Chen had executed search warrants on his home, his personal vehicle, and his office at the police station. The local paper ran the story on page 1, complete with a sidebar about ongoing concerns regarding police accountability in small communities. But the real fireworks started Thursday evening. I was having dinner at Ruby's bar when Kyle Brennan burst through the door, his face flushed and his expensive suit wrinkled. He looked around wildly until he spotted me at my usual table. "You son of a bitch," he shouted, loud enough to stop every conversation in the place. "You cost me everything." I looked up from my fish and chips. "Kyle, you look upset." "Upset? My clients are dropping me left and right. The agency's talking about termination. My wife filed for divorce this morning." "That's terrible." "Have you considered that actions have consequences?" Kyle started toward me, his fists clenched, but Ruby stepped between us with a baseball bat in her hands. "Kyle, honey, you need to calm down before you do something you'll regret." "I regret ever setting foot in this godforsaken town." "Then leave," I said simply. Problem solved. Kyle looked around the bar, seeing nothing but hostile faces and unsympathetic stares. These people had known me for 15 years, had hired me to work on their homes, had trusted me with their family's safety. Kyle was just the slick outsider who'd helped destroy a marriage and traumatize a child. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cracking. "Yes, it is." Kyle left, and the bar slowly returned to normal. But I could feel the anticipation in the air. Everyone knew the main event was still coming. Friday morning, I got the call I'd been expecting. "Cal?" Vanessa's voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "We need to talk." "Do we?" "Please, please." We met at the diner on Route 302, neutral ground where we'd had our first date 17 years ago. Vanessa looked like she'd aged a decade in the past week. Dark circles under her eyes, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "I know you hate me," she said without preamble. "I don't hate you, Vanessa. I don't feel anything for you at all." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "Cal, I never meant for any of this to happen. It got out of control." "Which part? The affairs, or getting our daughter terrorized by your psychotic boyfriend?" "Greg's not psychotic. He's just intense." I stared at her across the table. This woman I'd married, this woman I'd loved, this woman I'd built a life with. "He hit you with a hammer, Vanessa. He chased our 8-year-old daughter through the house with a taser. If that's not psychotic, what is?" He was angry. He found out about Kyle, and he lost his temper. "So you admit it. You were sleeping with both of them." Vanessa's composure finally cracked, and tears started streaming down her face. "I was lonely, California. You were always working, always tired. I felt like I was invisible." "So you decided to become visible by destroying our family?" "I want to make this right. I want us to try again." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. Divorce papers, custody agreements, financial settlements. All drawn up by the best lawyer in Portland, all heavily favoring me thanks to the evidence I'd provided. "Sign these," I said, sliding the envelope across the table. Vanessa opened it and scanned the documents, her face growing paler with each page. "Cal, you're taking everything." "I'm taking what's mine. The house, the workshop, primary custody of Maddie. You can have your car and whatever personal belongings you want." "I'll fight this. I'll get my own lawyer." "With what money? Kyle's broke, Greg's suspended without pay, and your real estate license is under review by the state board. Good lawyers are expensive, Vanessa." She looked at me with something approaching desperation. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to sign the papers, pack your things, and leave town. I want you to stay away from Maddie until she's old enough to decide for herself whether she wants a relationship with you. And I want you to understand that every choice you made led to this moment." Vanessa stared at the papers for a long time, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. Finally, she pulled a pen from her purse and signed each document. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know you are. But sorry doesn't fix what you broke." I left her sitting in the diner and drove home, to my house, my workshop, my life. Maddie was waiting for me on the front porch, having spent the afternoon with Mrs. Henley. "Is it over, Dad?" she asked, taking my hand as we walked inside. "Yes, sweetheart. It's over." That night, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had always given my life meaning. Tomorrow, I'd start rebuilding. Not just furniture and cabinets, but trust and security and the kind of life Maddie deserved. Greg Larkin was facing criminal charges and would likely spend the next few years in prison. Kyle Brennan had left town in disgrace, his career and marriage in ruins. Vanessa had signed away her rights to everything we'd built together and would be starting over with nothing. The hammer had fallen twice, once when Greg lost his temper and destroyed my family, and once when I made sure he understood the consequences of his actions. Justice, it turned out, was a lot like carpentry. It required the right tools, careful planning, and the patience to see the job through to completion, 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 completion.